Right now, somewhere in your kitchen, there is probably a bottle of something sweet and slow. You pour it. It takes its time. You've never once thought of it as dangerous. But on a January afternoon in Boston, that same slow, sweet liquid killed 21 people in under a minute. The real answer for how is far stranger than anything in the official accident report. This is the story of the Great Molasses Flood. Picture Boston's North End in 1919. Narrow streets, brick tenements packed close together, horses pulling carts, children playing near the waterfront on their lunch break from school, and looming over all of it, a steel tank 50 feet tall, holding more than 2 million gallons of raw molasses. The tank belonged to the Purity Distilling Company. The molasses inside wasn't for pancakes, it was for industrial alcohol, used to manufacture munitions during the war that had just ended. Speed mattered more than safety. The tank had been built in a hurry. Workers noticed problems almost immediately. The tank groaned. It leaked. Local children would bring cups to the base of it and scrape off the sweet drips that seeped through the rivets. Nobody thought much of it. A leaking tank felt like a nuisance, not a warning. Then came January 15th. The temperature had swung wildly that week, from freezing to unusually warm. At 27 minutes past noon, the tank gave way. Witnesses described a sound like machine gun fire, the rivets popping one after another. Then the steel walls peeled open. A wave of molasses, estimated at 25 feet high, surged through the streets at an estimated 35 miles per hour. 35 miles per hour. Faster than most people can sprint. The wave crushed buildings. It lifted a firehouse off its foundation. It swept horses, wagons, and people into its path. And here is the detail that stays with you. Molasses is thick. It should have slowed down fast. Instead, it drowned people standing still because once it caught you, it didn't let go. 21 people died. Over 150 were injured. Some victims weren't found for days, buried under a hardening lake of sugar. So why did investigators spend years arguing about the cause? And why does this disaster still puzzle engineers a century later? For decades, the official explanation blamed anarchists, a bomb, some said, planted to protest the company. It was 1919, after all, a year gripped by real anarchist bombings across the country, including one at the Attorney General's own house in Washington. Blaming a bomb was convenient. It meant nobody at the company had to answer for the tank itself. But a courtroom told a different story. In one of the longest civil trials in Massachusetts history at the time, engineers testified that the tank had been poorly designed and never properly tested. The steel was too thin. The safety factor was far below what similar tanks required. The company had rushed construction to cash in on wartime alcohol demand, and it showed. The court ruled against the company. It was one of the first major cases in American history where corporate negligence, not sabotage, was formally blamed for mass casualties. That should have ended the mystery. It didn't. Because there was still a nagging question nobody could fully explain: why molasses, of all things, moved fast enough to kill. This is where the story gets genuinely strange, and where science finally caught up with history nearly 100 years later. In 2014, a group of students at Harvard, working with engineer Nicole Sharp, decided to model the physics of the flood using real molasses and real fluid dynamics. What they found reshaped how historians understood the disaster. Molasses behaves like what scientists call a non-Newtonian fluid. Its thickness, its viscosity, changes dramatically with temperature. On the morning of the flood, temperatures had spiked nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit in a single day. Warmer molasses flows far faster than cold molasses, so in that first instant the wave moved almost like water, fast, violent, impossible to outrun. But then, as the molasses spread and cooled in the January air, it did something almost cruel. It thickened again. Survivors and rescuers described how the syrup went from a fast-moving wave to a sticky, hardening trap within minutes. People who had survived the initial wave found themselves stuck, unable to move, as the substance solidified around their bodies. Rescue workers had to wade through molasses up to their knees to reach victims, and some of the dead weren't recovered until the spring thaw, a wave you could not outrun, a trap you could not escape. Around the same time, structural engineer Ronald Mayville was hired to formally re-examine the tank's original design using modern engineering standards. His conclusion was blunt. The steel used in the tank was too thin for its size, roughly half the thickness that would be considered safe by later codes. Worse, the rivets holding it together were placed under stress the material could not sustain, especially as temperatures fluctuated. Mayville's analysis effectively confirmed, with modern precision, what that 1919 courtroom had argued using far cruder tools. The tank was doomed before it was ever filled. But there's a piece of this story that goes beyond engineering, and it's the piece that makes this more than just an accident report. Historian Stephen Puleo spent years researching the flood for what became the definitive account of the disaster. What he uncovered wasn't only a story about metal fatigue, it was a story about who gets believed and who gets blamed when disaster strikes a poor immigrant neighborhood. The North End in 1919 was home to mostly Italian immigrants. When the tank first began leaking years earlier, residents' complaints were largely ignored. After the disaster, the company's first instinct was to blame outsiders, foreign radicals, rather than admit its own tank had failed. It took years of persistent legal pressure from the very community that had been dismissed to finally force the truth into a courtroom. That pattern should sound familiar to you, even now. A community raises a concern. It gets dismissed as an overreaction, and it isn't until the worst happens that anyone in power takes it seriously. To this day, Boston keeps a strange, quiet reminder of the flood. Locals will tell you that on hot summer days, if you stand near the old tank site by the harbor, you can still catch a faint sweet smell rising from the pavement. Scientists have never confirmed it, but the story persists anyway, passed down the same way the disaster itself was, mouth to mouth, generation to generation, refusing to fully disappear. Here's what's easy to miss about a story like this. It isn't really about molasses. It's about how disaster hides in the things we assume are harmless: a slow liquid, an old tank nobody double-checked, a complaint nobody followed up on. None of it looked urgent, right up until the moment it was. So the next time you pour something thick and sweet and slow into your morning coffee, you might think of Boston in 1919, of a wave that outran grown adults, of a substance you were taught to think of as gentle, that once moved fast enough and hardened fast enough to become one of the strangest mass casualty events in American history. You've probably never thought about how dangerous something sweet and slow could be. Now you know it already was.